Well, to talk about this, we're now joined by Martine St-Victor, communications strategist and general manager at Edelman in Montreal, and Jonathan Kalles, vice president at McMillan Vantage, and also a former Quebec advisor to Justin Trudeau. Hello to both of you.
Hello.
Listen, Martine.
Hi, Michael.
Hi, Jonathan. Listen, Martine, I'm going to ask you to start us off here because I wonder about the impact of Marc Miller's comments here. Of course, he's no political neophyte. People know him in Quebec and throughout the country. But has his comments about the state of the French language hurt him and, by extension, hurt the Carney government in Quebec?
I don't know if it's hurt him. What I would like to say is that he's very appreciated in his writing. And I think nuance also is extremely important in this context. One of the issues Mr. Miller has had is the fact that Premier Legault has brought up more than once in the past that the spoken language at home, the percentage of Quebecers who speak French at home had gone down. And what Mr. Miller has brought up, and he brought it up again yesterday, is that the fact that people don't necessarily speak French at home doesn't necessarily mean that they don't speak French once they leave the house. And he gave the example of his own family. He said, at home we speak Swedish. Does that affect the French language? It doesn't. Then he gave the fact that he did the vast majority of his schooling in French. And so I think this nuance is important. The other nuance that's important is that the way that Premier Legault speaks of Mr. Miller, it's as if he's not from Quebec. He is. And so when he's been attacked left and right, and it's very bizarre to hear some of the comments, and it's as if they're talking about him as if he were an outsider. He is not.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Jonathan, what do you say to that? Has this comment or this commentary hurt Marc Miller and by extension the federal government?
I don't think it's hurt Marc Miller, and I'm not sure in the long run, even in the medium term, it'll hurt the federal government. Marc Miller, I think both Martine and I would agree, is somebody who speaks his mind, but he's also just generally a very good communicator. So he probably, if he were to do it all over again, probably would have been a little extra nuanced because he's become a bit of a lightning rod. And both the CAQ and François Legault's government, which is, sitting in the teens in popular support and looking like they're going to get a shutout in the next election, and the Parti Québécois and its leader, Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon, who now has a 20-point lead almost in the polls, both of them love fighting with Marc Miller, because Marc Miller is this sort of epitome of Justin Trudeau's friend, the Trudeauist, federalist, evil, trying to impose English and destroy the French language. So Martine's very right when she says a lot of this requires a lot of nuance, but right now we're talking about the pure nasty part of politics, which is you pick up, maybe even out of context, or take just a part of a sentence, throw it out there and go after somebody. But especially, I would say right now for the Legault government and his comments yesterday, really trying to grab at anything that will improve their numbers. And as for Mr. Plamondon, well, Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon and Marc Miller went to law school together. They've known each other for a long time. This is now just a matter of fodder. Mr. Saint-Pierre Plamondon's comments today were even more outrageous, if you can believe it, than Legault's yesterday, where he claimed that the cultural milieu, who sent, congratulatory emails and letters to Marc Miller on his new post, called them pretty much traitors for doing that. So the hyperbole is, at a new level. And with an election less than 10 months away, I think we can only expect more, not less.
Okay. And when you say that, Jonathan, I underline the part that François Legault does have very low approval numbers. I think he's actually the least approved of leader in the country right now. But when he uses that type of hyperbole, to use your terminology there, Jonathan, does that actually have resonance, though? Because at the end of the day, he Mr. Legault can say whatever he wants to say, but does it have resonance across the province?
Well, we saw a poll today that, despite the provincial Liberals really in the middle of their own controversy, going down 6-7 points, the Legault government didn't pick up a single point out of that. So it seems like whatever they do right now, they're really at a fin de régime, the end of their mandate, and I don't think that anything they're going to do is change their fortunes unless they maybe change their leader that worked federally. So, right, it's what you see from François Legault is a lot of flailing. Now, will anybody in Quebec be offended by what Marc Miller said, taken out of context? I'm sure that's sort of easy fodder, but I don't think in the midterm it's really going to drive anyone, because anybody who would be impacted by that kind of hyperbole probably already wouldn't vote for the Liberals federally and probably aren't a loss in a sense in the long run. You have to be careful. There are a bunch of very close ridings to the bloc that were won in the last election by hundreds, if not a single vote in Terrebonne. And, in an election that could be coming up as soon as, I don't know, the next 4, 5, 6 months, you have to be careful. You don't want to alienate any voter, but I don't think it's going to have a massive impact.
Okay, listen, I want to, Martine, I'll get you to comment in a moment, but I want to play here right now some words that we heard from Minister Miller today in Ottawa. He talks about all that he has done in terms of policy and funding choices in the past to promote the French language in Quebec and throughout the country, for that matter. Take a listen right now to Marc Miller.
Regret your comments yesterday, the Quebec Premier was calling.
No, I said what I said, and I think I've proved in my previous roles that in doubling French immigration in Canada, which is something the federal government had never done, and been part of a government that recognized the decline of the French language across Canada and modified the law on official languages as a result, plus the $4 million investment, and send $800 million to Quebec for francization of new arrivals. It's nice to talk, but actions count, and I think I've proved myself.
So he says his actions count. Martine, will this quickly go away? Is that the strategy he needs to take, just to, try not to comment on it and let his actions speak for themselves, or does he have to be a bit more active to address the issue in Quebec?
I think this will go away. Jono can attest to the fact that 3 weeks ago, the brouhaha were between the Premier and doctors. Last week it was with unions. This week it's Marc Miller. Next week it will be somebody else. And he was right to point out his successes. People don't remember that, and they certainly don't have it on top of mind. So he was right to remind everybody of that. But he does need to move on. And I will say this. He was very appreciated when he was Minister of Indigenous Affairs. He learned the language. That was very appreciated. It showed us a very sensible side to him, which is always a good thing for politicians to be able to showcase. And I think also big picture is that in Quebec, it's certainly appreciated that Mr. Carney picked a minister from Quebec. And so I do think this will go away.
Okay. Listen, let's move on from this, because I also want to talk about Stephen Guilbeault here, because of course Marc Miller is back in cabinet, not only because, but really put into cabinet right now because Stephen Guilbeault resigns over the MOU Ottawa signs with Alberta. I'm wondering, given Stephen Guilbeault's status in Quebec, does his resignation from the federal cabinet, not the government, but from the federal cabinet, does that have an impact in the province as to how Quebecers view the Liberal Party, Jono?
I think to an extent in the short term, yes, he's got great recognition. People know who he is, and he's not a new face on the environment, but really on the public scene. He was on Tout le monde en parle on Sunday nights, the most watched TV program in Quebec, and he was very emotional about his choice. But it was not a tear it down, burn it down resignation. This was not Chrystia Freeland of a year ago. This is not Jody Wilson-Raybould of 7, 8 years ago. This was a very dignified, decision where he said, listen, we agree to disagree. I have enormous respect for the Prime Minister, and, I have to be able to look myself in the mirror. I think they both, behaved in a smart way where they were respectful, and that's what happens sometimes in politics. Stephen Guilbeault has, again, he's well known, but I'm not sure outside of Montreal he's that influential that people will follow everything that he says. You have a government in Quebec that's been elected now twice that has had no environmental plan whatsoever in the CAQ. So it's not, like the rest of Canada, the single biggest issue right now for Canadian and for Quebec voters.
Mm-hmm. Martine, what do you say about that, the impact of Stephen Guilbeault's resignation from cabinet?
I think for a politician at large, it was a good thing. I think it restored trust because, as Jono said, he didn't leave with fracas. He left with dignity, with a lot of respect for his boss. And also it reminded us as electors that politicians are not robots. The fact that he showed so much emotion, I don't think anybody in good faith could question his sincerity. And I do think to restore trust in politicians, it might go a long way, because sometimes we wonder, do politicians really believe what they're trying to sell? And here we have an example that often they do. And it follows a former minister who left the CAC a couple of weeks ago because he couldn't go along with the new law regarding doctors. And I think these two events back to back really will help restore faith and trust in politicians. And certainly for Mr. Guilbeault, his departure was applauded. You have to remember that when he took on the position, there were a lot of people from the climate justice and environment that question his choice and question his commitment. And I think now he kind of restored that and will become a voice and certainly the face of what to do right next. Nobody can question his capacities and his knowledge of what's best for climate change. So against climate change. So I think for him for his brand, if you will, personal brand, it's only good news, because we know that he puts his faith in what he believes in.
Mm-hmm. Puts his faith in what he believes in. Jonathan, I'm going to pick up on a point that you said, though, about the environment not figuring very large right now amongst Quebecers in terms of priority, because it has been suggested when here in Ottawa when people are talking that this MOU in Alberta, with Alberta rather, could hurt the Prime Minister in British Columbia, but also in Quebec, considering there were many progressive votes who lent their vote to the Liberals in the last federal campaign. What do you say to that?
I think there's always a risk of that. I think that's a fair question. But, especially in the context of tariffs and Trump and the current economic context, the insecurity, add that on top of what was already serious challenge in terms of cost of living for every Canadian, every Quebecer. And I said this going back in March, April during the election campaign. Quebec voters are like Canadian voters. What was on their mind was tariffs and trade and cost of living. And I don't think that that's dramatically changed. So I don't think you have a perception that Marc Carney is anti-environment. He's taking a different tack. Stephen Guilbeault disagrees with that tack, but it's not like he's a climate science denier or he doesn't believe in these things. He has a different strategy to achieve net zero, let's say in 2050. He's still committed to that. He made that clear, the Prime Minister. And so Quebec voters, when it comes to an election, they'll have to ask themselves, yes, it's important to me, the environment, but is it more important than these other measures? And do I have confidence in Marc Carney? He'll have to deliver on a lot of the promises that he made, during the campaign and over the last 6 months, whenever that next election comes. His main opponent's going to be the Bloc Québécois, because the Conservatives certainly aren't any stronger on the environment. They have climate deniers there. But the Bloc, you have their leader, who's a former environment minister, who has a pretty lousy record on the environment too. So yes, it's important, but I don't think it's decisive.
Yeah. Martine, what would you say to that?
Yes, I will say we need to watch for the generational divide. Gen Z, it's survey after survey, the most important thing for them is the environment. Now, are they the largest voting bloc? They weren't the last election around, but this might be the issue that gets them to the polls next time. So I think this is something that we have to watch for, because for Gen Z, it is a priority. And I think also we have to look at what's going on a larger scale. When you remember the op-ed that Bill Gates recently published in the New York Times, where he kind of backtracked a little bit on the urgency of climate change. And so Canada has often been a leader, and let's see if the country will continue to be one. Stephen Guilbeault did say that he would try to continue to influence, and this is why I do believe that he's going to continue to be a leader, but just in a different capacity. He will continue to be a leader fighting the good fight, but in a different capacity.
Martine, Jonathan, appreciate the time. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for that.
Thanks.
Avec plaisir. Au revoir.
Au revoir.